Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Open Documentary Lab and Co-Creation Studio public lecture series. This is the second in our series, and my name is Kat Cizek, she, her. I am a Gen X white woman sitting in front of a LiDAR scan of a Florida cypress tree. And I am the artistic director and the research scientist at the Co-Creation Studio, and I welcome you all on behalf of all of us at the lab. Today, I have the pleasure of co-moderating with Shireen Anlin, who is our partner of the studio at our AI and Documentary Research Initiative with Witness, a human rights media organization. Hi, Shireen.
Hi, Kat. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here for this great conversation today with APA folks. So I'm Shireen. I'm from Witness, as Kat mentioned. I'm the media technologist at the Technology Threats and Opportunity team, where we really look at synthetic media, generative AI, misinformation, exploring the opportunities. Together with Kat a lot since 2018, looking at satire and all the gray areas and really evolving into our current focus on documentary and AI. And also at Witness, we're looking at the threats, detection solution, provenance solution. What does it mean? What do we need? How we can signal our evidence to really build and develop trust in our media landscape. So I'm really happy to be here, and back to you, Kat.
Thanks, Shireen. Today, we welcome the co-directors of Archival Producers Alliance to talk about generative AI and documentary. The Alliance was founded over a year ago to examine the ethical consequences as well as the practical challenges of generative artificial intelligence in documentary, on the public record, and of collective memory. Today, this formidable team represents 400 members in over 20 countries with input from over 100 people. This is a lot of numbers, 100 people in the documentary field last month. They released a best practices guide, which has been endorsed again by 50 documentary companies and organizations. We're really honored. I'm honored to sit on the advisory board of the APA and to introduce you now to Rachel Antell, Stephanie Jenkins, and Jennifer Petrucelli. And without further delay, hello, everyone. Nice to see you again.
So good to see you. So excited to be here. Okay, well, here, I'm just going to share my screen here to get started. We're really excited to be here. We love the work that MIT Open Documentary Lab does, and of course that Shireen does at Witness, and that Co-Creation Studio does, and we're happy to be here with you to review our document, Best Practices for Use of Generative AI in Documentaries. So we released this last month, marking the culmination of an 18-month effort that brought together people from all across the documentary space. And we had the opportunity to talk with Kat and Shireen when we launched the guidelines at the Camden Film Festival in the middle of September. And we're really thrilled to be here with them again. So to dive in, while many individual filmmakers, production companies, and distributors are grappling with this issue around generative AI, and creating their own internal standards about how to use this emerging technology, our hope and intention at the Archival Producers Alliance is that what we're releasing and presenting will help create an industry-wide shared language and understanding about the use of generative AI within the documentary space. We feel really strongly that guidelines need to come from within our own industry, and certainly, of course, in conversation with tech industries and others, but primarily from within our own documentary filmmaking community. And of course, it's important to acknowledge here that there are no hard and fast rules about what a documentary is, about what a truth is, about what collective understanding is. So rather than making sweeping statements or definitions, our document operates within a spectrum of over 100 years of evolving documentary ethics.
Okay. So before we talk about the guidelines themselves, I'm guessing that many people are wondering why it is that it's archival producers who are talking about AI. As archival producers, we spend a lot of time researching and tracking down historical audiovisual materials and a lot of time licensing and mastering those materials. But we also put time into confirming the veracity of the elements. And in the spring of 2023, right around when ChatGPT was all over the news, Jen and I started seeing synthetic historic images and audio being brought into documentary workflows, and they were indistinguishable from the real historical images which we were bringing in. And at that time, it was unclear to the filmmakers whether there was any need for them to be transparent around their use of generative AI. There wasn't any precedent, and it was really the Wild West. So given our role as fact checkers of third-party media, this raised big questions and concerns for us, certainly in terms of the film we were working on, but also looking forward, concerns about how documentary would maintain audience trust as well as its commitment to historical truth. So we reached out to Steph, who had built a strong community of archival producers in New York, and we gathered with them to discuss how GenAI could impact our archival work, as well as the documentary field more broadly, and whether there was anything we could do to move that needle. So we started having regular meetings to discuss what was at stake, and we ended up collectively writing an open letter that outlined our concerns and was signed by over 100 documentary professionals. And the response was overwhelmingly positive, as we found that filmmakers and executives alike were really looking for guidance in that moment on how to approach and possibly integrate generative AI. So we formalized our group as the Archival Producers Alliance, which we call the APA, and about 15 of us met weekly for over 2 months, doing a deep dive into all things Gen AI. We wanted to understand what it was, how it was being used, how it could impact documentary in positive and negative ways, how the questions that it raised for documentary were or were not different from, say, recreations, how it might impact jobs and workflow and the historical record. So we researched other guidelines that were coming out. We talked to folks who'd created similar documents in Canada and England. We brought in film scholars and AI technologists and legal experts and filmmakers who were already using the technology. And it quickly became clear that AI is here and here to stay. So what we wanted to do was to encourage people to take a collective breath and move forward with thoughtfulness and intention as we began to navigate the new and rapidly changing landscape. We wanted to jumpstart a conversation, basically. So following our period of research, the group hashed out the basic ideas and structure of the document, which Jen, Steph, and I then edited into a draft of the guidelines and presented at IDA's Getting Real conference last April. Subsequent drafts were then reviewed by dozens of filmmakers, AI experts, lawyers, standards and practice experts, and E&O insurers, which was probably the highlight because who even knew you could talk to an E&O insurer? It's great. And all that went into producing the final document. And I want to just take one more moment to note here that many of the tech companies are also doing work around the ethics of AI. And they're creating standards around it. And that's great, and it's necessary. But I don't believe that their primary interest is in the protection of the documentary field, despite the fact that they are coming and speaking to the documentary community about ethics. So what we did was very intentionally a grassroots effort, a very grassroots effort, because we believe that for any set of standards to be embraced by the documentary community, it needed to come from within. So.
Thanks. My name is Jen Petrucelli. I'm an archival producer and also one of the founders, co-founders of the APA. And before we get into the nuts and bolts of the guidelines themselves, we wanted to start by clarifying that this is not a legal document, but really we see it more as an ethical one that, as Rachel and Steph alluded to, we hope can help frame a conversation and create a common language around the use of this new technology. The document itself is broken into 2 main parts. The first is an opening statement, which asserts what is essential about documentary film and why it needs to be protected. It also acknowledges how GenAI may benefit the field of documentary, for example, to tell stories that may have been suppressed or not recorded in some way, or to protect the identities of people for whom appearing in a documentary presents a risk to their safety. The second part of the documentary is a practical guide, really like nuts and bolts, for filmmakers who are grappling with whether and how to integrate GenAI into their work. But before we get into that and the details, we want to just clarify some terms. When we talk about AI, we think about there being two broad categories. The first we think of as so-called assistive AI, which is used for things like transcription or logging, more workflow applications. The second is generative AI, and by that we mean the creation of images or video or audio in response to user prompts. Our guidelines are addressing the second, and specifically generative AI that creates new material whole cloth or substantively alters existing materials in a way that changes their meaning and might confuse an audience about what they're actually seeing and the origin of that material. So with those definitions, Steph is gonna start us off going through the document.
Right, so the first section is value of primary sources. And by that, we mean authentic audiovisual records that are created by humans. And so in this section, we make the case for considering use of these sources first, because they provide a window into a specific event that happened in an actual time and place and were witnessed by someone. And while we are very much aware of the bias that archives represent, they are subjective places. We assert that their authorship and context can be known, and therefore primary sources, their biases can be understood, framed, and wrestled with. And when writing the guidelines, we thought about this a lot. And one question we asked was, what's the difference between, for example, creating something as quotidian as an elm tree on a hill versus using a human-made one? And what we settled on is this idea that human creation is subjective and a subject can be held accountable. And the same is not true when the creation is a composite from unknown sources, as is the case with a lot of GenAI and current large language models. So when filmmakers do opt to use GenAI in lieu of archival materials, we offer 4 things to consider. The first is GenAI and the historical record. The second is understanding algorithmic bias. That is an important part of how synthetic media is made, and I'll dive into that a little more. And then GenAI alterations to primary sources and reenactment and recreation. So algorithmic bias. Last week, Jen here wanted just to check in, because a lot of tech companies are talking about how they're working really hard with algorithmic bias to make sure that everyone is represented. So she just went into the common tools that are generative AI tools and typed in a CEO. What comes up? White men in a very particular stance and suit. Here's the next one. Let's see, this one is from OpenAI, I believe. Yes. And the prompt here is cleaning person. And what comes up is a woman of color. And the next is a doctor. This was also from OpenAI. And here you have white men in an office. So here's a particularly egregious headline: Google apologizes for missing the mark after Gemini generated racially diverse Nazis. This was from February from The Verge. So when we're working with large language models, they produce things that are biased. And so we are really encouraging documentary filmmakers when they opt to use generative AI to know that they're not going to be historically accurate, because they're based, well, because they're not real historical images, of course, but also that they're based on a data set that in itself is biased. So onto the next, onto the point around alterations of real images. So here, just to show you this, here's a real image, New York and bridges from Brooklyn, circa 1913. This is from the Library of Congress. So something that we're seeing the most as far as how documentary filmmakers are using generative AI is on a very common tool that's available through Adobe called Generative Fill. So I'm going to walk you through that. So first, here are some images that I generated on Midjourney that look very similar to the images on Library of Congress. And here I loaded it into Adobe Photoshop. I deleted the sides, and here, without even really opting in any way, here's a generative fill button that comes up anytime that you are in Adobe Photoshop. This is the image after they've filled in the sides. So as you can see, this is a little absurd, and I have this absurd image because as a native New Yorker, I'm familiar with what these bridges look like. One thing that you'll notice is Adobe decided to put in this random building that was definitely not a part of the skyline in 1913, nor is it now. They chose not to have boats in the water and to have completely blank space that looks like it could be water. And so just to compare, here's the real image, which has another bridge, additional buildings, and also a perspective that would have been part of this medium when it was taken in 1913. So as you can see here, what they generate is not anywhere close to reality. So we're really encouraging documentary filmmakers, even though it might be tempting to take a vertical photograph and have it fill the whole frame, that what you're doing is basically inventing a totally new image that is not going to be historically accurate.
Okay. So the second area of our guidelines, and probably the heart of it, addresses transparency about the use of GenAI. And it's both inward transparency and outward transparency. So by inward transparency, we're talking about tracking each generative AI element in the workflow so that everyone involved in the production, from producers to editors to legal to distributors, they're all aware and on the same page. And then there's outward transparency. And outward transparency is transparency with the audience. And we believe that that is crucial for maintaining the trust between the filmmaker and the viewer. There should never be any kind of confusion for anyone about what is and what is not generated, what is and is not authentic. Now, in terms of how that transparency is achieved, there are many different options. And they're as broad and varied as the creativity of the filmmaker themselves, for sure. And I think we're going to see this evolve greatly. But some of the ideas that we suggest or we offer as options are, one of them is lower thirds, bugs, or other types of watermarking on the material itself. And that's really the most dependable type of transparency, because the disclosure is not going to be separated from the piece of media itself. Whereas if so that if watermarked media is excerpted and separated from the rest of the film, the transparency is going to remain. But we also outline other methods, such as creating a visual vocabulary that's consistently used throughout the film to alert the audience of GenAI use, such as a unique frame around the material, a change of aspect ratio, a color wash that's used on the images, anything at all to set it apart from true historic images, primary source materials. Other options are having a reveal or insight about the use of AI integrated into the story itself, which could be referenced by a narrator or a subject of the film. And one really powerful and elegant example of this is in the documentary Another Body by Willa Films, where GenAI was used to protect the identity of subjects for whom appearing in the film presented a danger. And about 13 minutes into the film, the subject herself reveals that the face we're seeing and the voice we're hearing are not actually hers. And it's a very powerful moment, and you can see, and obviously not every film is going to lend itself to that kind of an elegant integration, but it does show how people are thinking about this and thinking about creating GenAI in very intentional and organic ways to their film. And then, of course, a very common method of transparency, which people use, is having a card with top of show or end of show language explaining the use of the AI. But it's important to keep in mind that viewers may not tune into the beginning or end of, of a program or stay around for the end of it. And so many of them are going to miss that crucial moment. And as I said before, often we're seeing pieces of documentaries excerpted and put on the web and making their way into other documentaries. And documentaries are part of the historical record. So once that happens, it's very hard to pull it back once it makes its way into the internet and is separated from any kind of disclosure. And then finally, we recommend additional acknowledgement of the use of AI in promotional materials such as trailers, press releases, anything like that. And that's been done in many wonderful documentaries, including Another Body, Andy Warhol Diaries, Welcome to Chechnya. And really, where there hasn't been transparency, that's where we've seen audience and public pushback. But when filmmakers have been open about using GenAI, we've seen much more easy acceptance from audiences.
And on to legal considerations. So the third section of the document addresses legal considerations, which, as many of you probably know, are evolving rapidly and very much unsettled. We've tried to keep the guidelines broad so that they will continue to be useful, both as the technology and the laws evolve. Given that, our overriding recommendation is to, if you're thinking about using GenAI in your film, is to seek legal advice from counsel with expertise in this area. Legal counsel is a key part of the inward transparency Rachel was just talking about. Lawyers should be aware of what AI material is in a film so that they can advise filmmakers on any risks and how to mitigate them. A few examples of things to be aware of is that you cannot currently in the US, you cannot copyright a generated image or video. So if you include a generated element in your film, it could be taken out and used by others freely. So, if it's like a key art image, it's not going to be exclusively under your copyright. GenAI may also unwittingly generate material that could open you up to a copyright or even defamation claims. So from a copyright perspective, we've used the example, if you prompt the software to create like a happy purple dinosaur, you could end up with something that is an infringement of Barney, say. Or if you were to create a synthetic voice and had that voice, of somebody famous, had that voice say things that they didn't actually say, you could be opening yourself up to a defamation claim. The other thing we want people just to be mindful of is this term ethical AI. It's complicated around who's sort of defining the ethics, but all of these large language models are trained on copyrighted materials. And again, the law is unsettled about whether that's going to be accepted under fair use or not, but it's something we think, since it's unsettled, people should really be thinking about and mindful of. And in terms of like the practical terms, for filmmakers, we see this like legal ambiguity as especially challenging for independent filmmakers. So if you're working on a film, it doesn't yet have distribution. Most streamers and broadcasters don't have clear policies yet around their standards for using GenAI. Many of them are pretty opaque. So if you're working on a film and you don't know what the standards are, in the 11th hour, when you do get a distributor, you might have to make adjustments. And we have seen that on some films that we've worked on, where filmmakers used GenAI and it was not in line with the standards of the broadcaster that they ultimately ended up with, and they had to go back and make changes. Our guidelines are in the hands of most major streamers. We've encouraged their documentary teams to be transparent by laying out strong and clear guidance for filmmakers to follow, and hopefully that will be in the works. We know that legal counsel can be expensive, but we, again, really encourage people to seek it if they're considering using this technology. And we just want to sort of give a shout out to a couple of places that can help with pro bono advice, the UCLA Law Clinic, who actually advised on the guidelines, and also the Cardozo Law School Film Clinic in New York City.
So the fourth section of the guidelines, which is the final section, addresses the ethical considerations of creating human simulations, which is a mouthful. When using generative AI technology to alter or manipulate the face, body, or voice of a real person, which is sometimes referred to as deepfake, we encourage filmmakers to take extra caution, even beyond transparency. And I want to add a note here about our process, because our thinking for this section evolved quite a bit between our first draft and the final one. Originally, the section was called consent, but in our feedback period, several lawyers and some filmmakers called into question this term, which has legal implications. And some kind of required consent could put a burden on filmmakers that might impact fair use, as well as more general use of third-party materials, and potentially provide ammunition for estates who are unhappy with their portrayal in a documentary. So we went back to the drawing board and we did a deep dive on what our concerns were that couldn't be addressed only by transparency. And one of the places that took us was to the guidelines created by the group DAWG, D-A-W-G, which stands for the Documentary Accountability Working Group, and the amazing work that they've done to consider the effects of documentaries on the subjects and creating a standard of care within that. So those ideas really helped frame our thinking and our understanding of what's at stake as we use GenAI to manipulate or even recreate the likenesses or voices of real people. And it helped us think through the reasons to at least consider getting consent from subjects to use their voice or likeness when that's possible, but also to take extra care with subjects who are not able to offer consent. And then finally, we want people to really consider the potential cultural sensitivities of using synthetic media to create a person's image or voice. One anonymized example that I can share is that an APA member was working on a film about a famous subject who was deceased. And the filmmakers wanted to have that subject read from their own diaries, words that she had actually written, but were never recorded being read aloud. The subject was from a different culture than the filmmakers. And even once it seemed that they could address the rights issues and the legal hurdles, such as clearing the source recordings from a commercial archive to train the AI voice model, it still became clear that in this particular culture, resurrecting someone in this way after death was actually highly disrespectful. So they did back away from that and find other ways to represent that voice. So again, these are some of the reasons that we recommend putting extra time and extra consideration before using GenAI in this way. And as is true with the rest of the best practices document, we're not saying not to create human voice or likeness, but rather offering filmmakers guidance on what might be important to consider as they navigate this new and possibly delicate territory in a responsible way.
All right, so yay, those are the guidelines. It's actually only really 5 pages of guidance followed by 5 pages of methodology. So it's not so scary. People can read it. It's, I think, pretty fun to read, but I'm really biased as a co-writer. So as far as next steps, we have a feedback form on our website, which I put in the chat earlier. And people can still become an endorser as an individual or also as a production company or film festival. And as these are really geared toward filmmakers, distributors, and film funders, that's who we're hoping to come on as endorsers. So people who will really use this in their work. And then we also have a feedback form. So we will at some point, probably next year, do an update of the guidelines. We wrote them, you know, agnostic of the technology enough and really more cognizant of the ethics of them, but we might have to do an update. So that's why we have a feedback form up there, because we love to hear from people. You can also subscribe to our mailing list to get quarterly updates. I'm throwing that in the chat now. We'd love to have you. And don't worry, we don't spam too much. And yeah, and we're, of course, looking for members. Members are defined as people who are archival producers, and anybody can join from around the world. So, we are really at the beginning of a more public conversation within our field about how, when, and if to incorporate generative AI into documentaries. And, we really wrote these best practices with an eye toward getting them general enough to maintain their relevance, as I said. So what's next? Our goal over the next year between 24 and 25 is to present the guidelines at conferences, webinars like this one, and get the best practices into filmmakers' hands and make sure that they have the tools to best utilize them. And so to that end, we are planning a series of panels and workshops, so you can find those also on our website. And we also really want to encourage conversations between filmmakers about their use of the guidelines, as well as the impacts that they're seeing on the documentary field. And also, as a part of making sure that this conversation is happening amongst as many people in the community as possible, we have so far translated the guidelines into 5 languages. They were translated by people, not by ChatGPT. They are in Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, French, and German. And those are also on our website. So if you know anyone that might be interested, please send those along.
Great. And in addition to doing panels and workshops, such as this one, over the next year or so, we're in the process of creating what we're calling a toolbox for implementation of these guidelines, with materials that filmmakers can use in their workflows when considering using GenAI. This will include things like cue sheets that filmmakers can deliver to lawyers or E&O insurers and distributors, crediting guidance, questions for filmmakers to consider if they're thinking about using GenAI in their projects, as well as referrals to external resources such as, excuse me, other useful ethical guidance, relevant legal precedents, and referrals to legal teams well-versed in this area. Excuse me. And finally, the last thing that we're working on that's sort of part of the toolkit is case studies. We're planning on conducting a series of real-world case studies. We know that in the next period and currently, AI is going to be used in a lot of different projects within the documentary field, and we want to learn about how this plays out on the ground in terms of how the tools are being used, what stories it's enabling be told, and if and how the best practices guidance are useful to filmmakers in their thinking. So we intend to work with some of our endorsing organizations to identify and conduct these studies over the course of the next year. And I think that wraps things up. Before we go to Q&A, we wanted to thank Kat for having us, and Akhmirat for helping coordinate all the logistics and the tech today, and also Shirin for all your work and support over the last year. And I think with that, we're going to go to Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much to you, Stephanie, Rachel, and Jennifer for this incredible document, but also this open and highly responsive process that you're embarking on, and that you've already shown us so much openness in the way that you've been creating this process. So it's really remarkable, as someone who studies co-creative processes and knows how hard that can be. It's really, really remarkable. We're going to take questions we've got quite a few people in the room, so maybe we can turn off the screen share and get everybody's faces and names on this. Hello. And we welcome you all to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. We'll start with Shireen. I think you've got some questions from us.
Yeah, I'm happy to start with some. Thanks. I will just amplify what Kat just said. Thank you so much for your wonderful work. There is such a need also for your next step of like toolkits and learning from real cases, how it's being implemented, what is like the ceiling participating in this, like choosing what tools to use and how to actually like disclose. There is really a lot of obstacles, so it will be very interesting to learn from your case study, and I'm looking forward to follow up on that. One of my questions was, I have a few, but one of them is I'm very curious. Rachel, you described how the last part you kind of like you shaped it, you changed it from consent to ethical consideration because of like the conversation you had on pushbacks about what consent actually mean. But I'm curious in more like a general overview. How is your like approach or has changed on the urgency to have those guidelines through your work? How is it being shaped through the year that you've been working on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's changed pretty drastically. When we first started working on this, a lot of filmmakers that we brought it up with were like, really? That's happening? People are using that? And a lot of them hadn't seen it yet. And that's not the case now. Pretty much most people are familiar with the possibilities, and a lot of people are playing with it and trying to figure out how they might or might not be able to integrate it. So that feels very different. And we're getting very different input from the community as a result. Over the course of that year and a half, the tools have changed as well, and the capabilities. I think when we first started, it was before Sora had come out, so we hadn't actually seen it used with video. We'd only seen still images and audio. So one of the things that makes it feel so urgent is that the tech is developing. This kind of technology does not develop at a human pace. It's exponential, and it improves exponentially as well in terms of looking real. I mean, so far, as Steph mentioned, we haven't seen those improvements in terms of the algorithmic bias. You would think we had. There's certainly a lot of the companies are trying to correct, but as we saw with that Verge headline, there's overcorrection happening where they're writing, people of color into places they never were, like the Nazi, like that was just a crazy example of, it's both the lack of diversity and overcorrection and just all of the different things. So I think that's changing. And while the tech changes, it's also being integrated into the tools that people are already using. And it's not always clear to people when they're using AI. What we started to actually hear was some people saying, I didn't even realize I was using generative AI. And so that's also made us realize the need for filmmakers to be very proactive in trying to figure out where AI is being put into the tools that they are reliant on so that they can make their own decisions about whether or not they're going to use AI. I think it's, people use what they want to use, but they need to know. And so we've realized the need for that to be part of the conversation as well. Yeah. Steph?
I want to add to that and just say, I think when we first started, we were a bit reactive. We were like, what is going to happen with this? And then we started doing our research and seeing how filmmakers like Another Body, like Welcome to Chechnya, and others were using this technology to help protect subjects in this really intentional, transparent way that pushes our form forward. So that was amazing. And then, it really helped us. I mean, it helped me on a personal level, knowing that there is this huge technological revolution around generative AI happening, to really focus down on something that I personally care about. And I have spent the last 15 years of my career focusing on, which is archival research. And so what started as a bit of we're scared, we're reactive, then turned into us gathering a community of deeply thoughtful people that do what we do, who sought to actually affirm what we love, which are archival photographs, archival footage. What is of value that will not change from that material moving forward? And going from that place of affirmation is so much more constructive, and it makes it a lot easier to sleep at night than going from a place of panic and worry. So I'd say like that was a big transformation as well.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question from the chat from Kirsten Hamilton, who wonders if you could share your thought on how we might encourage the general public to be critical, yet place trust in images and media, especially on fast-paced platforms like TikTok, where the short reaction time often leaves little room for critical reflection. And I think Shireen might be able to talk a bit about TikTok as well. So I'm going to start with APA.
Well, again, this is one place where we definitely are focused on documentaries, which are a much, which are a smaller use case than something that goes as quickly. I mean, I think that people are just going to have to develop a level of media literacy in the same way that they have with, Google search results. It's like, well, maybe don't, write your term paper based on Wikipedia, but instead write it on something you found on Google Books that is citable. So I think people are going to have to develop the same level of awareness on using platforms. And I'd be curious, Shireen, what you have to say about this. And also curious what platforms are doing to combat misinformation. Just a quick side note there about detection tools. We've done searches into what detection tools are out there to say this is real and this isn't. And currently there are not super reliable ones. So for example, they'll pick up on somebody doing light retouching on a photograph that was taken by a real person. So they're detecting elements that are generated or elements that are sort of enhanced from a photo, but call it fully a generated photo. And so there's a lot, we're kind of going to be in an arms race for a very long time between generative software and detection software, because people are always going to want to have the fast, cheap solution of generating something.
And before I do, I also really want to hear from Shireen about TikTok. But before we go to that, I just want to piggyback on what Steph said. In the part, I mean, my feeling is we at least have absolutely no idea how to impact something like TikTok, the internet, any of those things. And for that reason, we really want to be putting up some kind of safeguards around documentary film to maintain its reputation, its place in the media landscape as a trusted cultural resource. Because I think that's going to become more and more necessary going forward as people are having their trust in media eroded. We want to make sure that this remains a place that's considered high quality and trustworthy in those ways. And that if you see something in a documentary that's being presented as reality, that's what it is. Because more and more people are just saying, I don't trust media, and we don't want everything to just disappear like that. So we are kind of circling the wagons in that way. Anyway.
And I'll just add one little button on the end of that. I think our hope is that like the guidelines and increased transparency within the documentary field, as people are watching documentaries and seeing however the transparency is getting conveyed within different films, whether it's title cards at the head or something integrated into the film, that is part of the media literacy that we hope will ripple out from this process, that people are becoming aware, wow, that looks so real, and yet it's actually generated, and that can help, sort of inform a skepticism of looking at material, or a critical eye for people that will ripple out from this work.
I don't want to take a lot of the space from this wonderful conversation, so I will just add a few anecdotes about TikTok. I think what we are doing, like at Witness, we're really looking at the pipe responsibility. So what APA you are doing, you're really providing tools and media literacy to the documentarians, to the creators themselves, to the producers. We are really looking how we can share the burden across developers, companies, and so one anecdote on TikTok is really interesting to see how they really were one of the first companies to really provide a very interesting and engaging labeling system for their users. And you can see different types of labels are being appears and communicating, and you can like duet with them, and right, that you can like co-edit those through using different labels. So that's one of the things TikTok really support, and it's leading to media literacy. But there's so much around that related also to detection, right? To the failure of really detecting that the generative AI or AI content ahead of time to really take down harmful content and really unmiss disinformation content. So that is a failure point of a lot of companies. And we saw a recent example of Instagram trying to label generative AI, but labeling a lot of human generated content as generative AI. So detection technology is really lagging behind, and it's a lot because of like training data and the lack of really able to follow through with all the generative techniques. But that's really fast context. Yeah, go ahead, Kath.
Jerry Flahive has a question about more examples of egregious examples of use of AI to generate false and misleading imagery in documentary or journalism. Is it on the increase, or are you ahead of the problem?
Great question. I mean, so first of all, as the APA, we take a stance that we're not like, oh, artist, egregious. You know, we're not, we're supporting artists and understanding what they're doing and using these new tools. And also understanding that the documentary commissioning market has cratered, and there's a lot less money floating around. Archival's really expensive. You know, there are a lot of reasons why people would want to use generative AI. So what I would say is, you know, it's kind of what we covered before. It's people are using it and not realizing that what they're doing is basically creating new historical artifacts. And I think that is where there's a lot of tension. So with this generative fill piece, there's that. And I was just at a footage conference a few weeks ago, and there was a lot of conversation around AI voice models that train historical voices. So I was on a panel with a very accomplished archive-based director, and he was talking about a historical figure that there were 3 minutes of her talking in very old age. And then he used those 3 minutes of audio to then train a voice model to have her read her entire autobiography. And then he said, it was great. Then we had 12 hours of, and I quote, her talking. And then I was on a panel being like, oh my gosh, like it's not her talking. It is a voice model from a certain time in her life that then you used to go ahead and basically create a hologram of this person that has a lot of assumptions about how she would read things, about how she would, you know, about her sense of humor, about what pauses that she would take, and also would assume that this person even would ever have read her autobiography out loud, which was published in the 1920s, when it would have been prohibitively expensive to record a 12-hour long autobiography. So I think that in some ways, those are the examples of what we're seeing the most. It is perfectly legal to do what he does. You can't defame a dead person in the United States. I think that the manuscript itself is in the public domain. I believe that the voice recording that he used is in the public domain. So it's all legal what he did, but it's this lack of understanding of no, just because it sounds like the real thing is absolutely does not mean that it is the real thing. And you need to let audiences know so that people don't think that there is a recording of this woman from the 1920s reading her autobiography. And yeah.
And I would just add in that case, even if you let people know, even if I know going into something that this voice was created, it is very hard for the audience to keep on teasing that out and understand that the inflections of the voice, the choices that are made around when something's being delivered with humor versus seriously, you know, when there's a note of anger versus a note of sadness in the voice, are all assumptions being made by who? We have no idea, no one in particular. It's a machine that's kind of putting this delivery together. It's not the same as when you have an actor who's reading something, and you can keep in your mind that the choices on the delivery are being made by the actor and the director, in conversation, presumably. But with this, there's some other author that's just unknown in what's being created. And I don't think I know I don't have the ability to really tease that out in a meaningful way. So even in the case of transparency, there's more to consider.
And I would say that falls into the primary sources, into the first section of our guidelines, into the reenactment and recreations, because basically what you're doing is using a generative voice model to do a reenactment. But what we say in the guidelines is when you're doing a reenactment that you're filming or you're working with an actor or something like that, people are actually accountable for the artistic choices that they're making. And we don't get that much into labor in our guidelines, but it's worth saying here that when you're using an AI voice model, what you're doing is also taking away a job from an actor. Or when you use an animation, when you create animation to do some sort of reenactment using generative AI, what you're doing is taking away a job from an animator. So these are all things to also consider. Is what you're losing is the human creative input that is coming from a point of view.
And I know we're belaboring this, but one other point on that is one of the things we see as somewhat dangerous about generative AI is the lack of expense and lack of time that's needed to use it. So when you're creating a recreation or you're working with an actor to do a voiceover or anything like that, you are putting a great deal of time and money into creating that scene. You're hiring camera people, you're hiring actors, you want to research so that you get the historical accuracy to what might have been worn or where they might have been, what might have been seen, all of that. Whereas because generative AI is so quick and cheap and easy to use, it's much easier not to put that same level of care. So that's one of the things we really emphasize is the need to, when you're using generative AI, not just use it as a shortcut, but really put the same level of intention and care and research into it as you would a recreation.
And to belabor the point, you've both talked extensively about unintended consequences or unintended impact on the industry. But what about malicious use? Can you talk a little bit about any case that you've seen in the documentary world of malicious use of AI?
I can't really speak to a malicious, and that also gets to the thing where it's like, I don't necessarily think people are trying to be malicious. I'm sure that there are political documentaries that I don't agree with that I might say is malicious, but that's coming from my personal perspective, not that of our organization. And I'd be curious, I would be curious in Witness's work, what you have found in this. What I will say though is all of this generative AI that's out on the internet, is making archival producers' job a lot harder. Part of our job, as Rachel said in the beginning, is to identify third-party and verify third-party content. So it's possible that if there's something out on the internet of Putin speaking or Trump speaking or something or Kamala Harris speaking that you think is real, but then you're not sure, it creates a lot of extra work to have to verify whether something is generated or not. And so there's also an onslaught, and it's really changed the jobs of archival producers, or will change the jobs of archival producers to do this verification.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, documentary may exist in a certain way within a certain bubble, but there is a larger sea of media being produced in the millions that certainly Witness has been addressing. Maybe can you just quickly comment on the context of malicious use of AI and what we're seeing on a broader scale?
Sure. We are about to end the year of elections, so we saw a lot of malicious use around politician likeness, voice cloning of politician, anti-fake of politician withdrawing, quote unquote, from their candidacy and spreading that online. But we also see a lot happening in conflict situation. We see coming from Sudan and from Israel, Gaza, a lot of use of AI generative voice and images. We don't see a lot of video, but deepfake is starting to kind of like deepfake video coming more and more into, we see more and more of that. But the main use of malicious use of deepfake is non-consensual gender and sexual abuse, especially targeting women, female politicians. We see a lot, and young girls. We also see young kids in general being very much affected, and that's a huge problem in the industry since we still don't have the right safeguards around that, and the spread of bots, notify bots on closed platform like Telegram and WhatsApp are just very, very accessible, and it's different audience and different media literacy, it's different regulation, and it's really hard to approach that problem. So that's on malicious use. But I also link to the chat. I do think there are, I wouldn't say it's a malicious use like use staff, but I think when the incentives are for making money, incentive for productions, an incentive of like creating a sensation, this is some kind of a malicious use in documentary. And one of the
Yes.
cases that I love to, I know, Kat, I keep referring to that case, but I put a link of what Jennifer did is a true crime documentary, and what they actually generative archive materials, quote unquote, of how Jennifer, the daughter, behaved in the night of, or the following the events of her parents. She murdered her parents. Sorry for the spoiler, but it was, I do consider that as a malicious use in documentary if when you're not disclosing that and you just want to make a sensation about some kind of like amplifying a story of a subject. So yeah, just another example.
Yes, and to that point, Shiri, Netflix and many of the other streamers now have their own AI departments in the closed box of a corporate organization that can choose to make decisions that we never even hear about. So it's really important to keep that context as well as the industry changes. We have a question from Kent Bai about the upscaling, AI upscaling of footage. Can you talk about the potential downsides to this use case?
I mean, we don't really address it too much in our document because we're primarily concerned with when the use of generative AI changes the meaning of what people are seeing or hearing in ways that could mislead the audience. And I don't, as far as I know, as far as we've sort of examined, we can't really think of ways that upscaling, just upresing, making it more vivid are necessarily going to do that. So we kind of leave that largely out, Steph.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where human discernment is so central, right? So it takes the filmmaker to look and be like, well, colorization, for example, is very contentious, especially in the moving image archives and preservation world. And there's the example of the Peter Jackson documentary, We Shall Not Grow Old, in which they colorized World War I footage. They were very transparent about doing that. And I can imagine that Peter Jackson also has a very large legal department that can protect him from any sort of libel claims or anything like that that could arise from something like that. What I will say is I did this one talk once at the Big Sky Film Festival, and someone talked about how he upresed some very, very low resolution footage from a courtroom. And there was a shot from a wide shot of the judge, and however the footage was upresed, it made it look like the judge was smiling at the point of this decision. When the filmmaker had been in the courtroom at the time and was not able to film himself and did not perceive that and doesn't believe that that was there. So what had happened in the upresing process is that it had actually changed the meaning substantially, the filmmaker thought, of what was happening in the footage. So I advised in that case, don't upres the footage. But if it really is up to your filmmaking team to be extremely deliberate about, okay, is this changing the meaning? And if so, let's be transparent about it or not engage with it at all. Jen, you were going to say something earlier, and I think I interrupted.
No, I mean, it's similar to what you're talking about. It's just that I think it's on a continuum. And, if you have an old photograph that is maybe harder to see, there's some information that's that you can learn from about the technology that was used at the time, and then when you up-res it to 4K, a photograph from the early part of the 20th century, it is, that is not the artifact in its authentic form. So it's like what Steph is saying, it is all on a continuum, and it's just being intentional and really thinking about what the use of the technology is doing to the material and doing to your relationship with the audience and their understanding about what they're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
A question from Akmirat Tuliev. Curious about the legal part where GenAI cannot be copyrighted. If a filmmaker were to train their own AI model on their own images and footage that they own the copyright to, from your knowledge, and you are not lawyers, would the final results still not be eligible for copyright?
That's our understanding, is that
that's our understanding. Jen, go for it.
That material generated by AI cannot be copyrighted currently in the United States. That it's only human generated products that enjoy copyright protection.
In that case, it would be a machine generated output. Yeah.
And there's still questions around the machine you use and what legal ramifications there are to using that specific machine to process the data.
And it depends on who you talk to even about that, because some people believe that no matter what, it's all going to be considered fair use.
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit of, I think the law hasn't quite figured out whether to think of AI as a tool or an author. And I think that's going to make a difference in how some of these cases go. I mean, it's interesting to me that, yeah, pretty much every lawyer we've talked to seems to think that fair use is going to be applicable to the way, because it's considered a transformative use. The way that the artificial intelligence takes lots of different pieces of media, breaks them up and reconfigures them, and they can be used in totally different ways. So it's in line with the current use of fair use, as I understand it. Again, we are not lawyers, but that's what we're hearing. But it is a little confusing, about whether AI is the tool or that's doing that, or the author who's doing that. So
I just threw in a case that y'all might be interested in into the chat of Zarya of the Dawn. It is a comic book that was written by a person, but then she spent the author spent a very long time in Midjourney, basically creating the same character to go throughout this graphic novel. And it took hundreds of prompts for her to be able to do this, to be able to create the same person over a long time in Midjourney is like over multiple images is very complicated and difficult. But in the end, the copyright said, nope, these are machine generated, even though you have human inputs. The human inputs on the prompts are not copyrightable. And the writing itself and the way that she laid out the graphic novel is copyrightable, but the images are not. So it's really complicated, because then if you get into a thing of what if you have AI generate your script for your documentary and you change it 20%? How much of that, it gets into really complicated stuff that the courts are really not sure of. And the Copyright Office is in a really complicated position right now.
Moving from law to speculative work, Eva Ko asks this question. The guidelines seem quite anchored in the thesis archives as evidence, but there's a long tradition of filmmakers working with archives in more expansive, speculative ways. Are there any general uses of AI outside of protecting subject entities that you can imagine as a positive contribution for the field and for APA?
Well, first of all, I'll say I'm a huge Adam Curtis fan, and I'm a huge fan of, oh my God, I'm blanking on his name. he did a film about Munch, and just uses a lot of sort of like speculative, futuristic / apocalyptic archival imagery in his work. I mean, let's see. Can we come back to that one? I'm struggling with it a little bit.
I mean, I would say one area that we've talked about is when somebody wants to tell a story that is not represented in the archive as it exists, right? I mean, the archives are biased too about whose stories are in there and from whose perspective. So that certainly seems like an area where a filmmaker might want to either, somebody was asking, I think from a legal perspective, if you had a small amount of material you wanted to use, generating more material from that, those few artifacts that do exist to tell a certain story. And I think that seems like a really promising area. Again, I think from our perspective, we just feel like the transparency piece then is really important so that people understand, again, what is authentic media and what is synthetic media, and that it's labeled in such a way that it doesn't get taken out and put in other films or other projects and confuse the historical record.
I was speaking with a filmmaker the other day who's making a film about someone who is going through a gender transition, from female to male, and they're very much closely working with the subject, using a generative voice model to speculate what that person's voice has been at different parts of their life. And I think that that's a really interesting case, and one where there is full transparency and full consent from the subject themselves.
And Shireen, you dropped a link to a blog at Witness about how human rights advocates have used GenAI in this speculative way. Can you give us a sense of what that?
Of course, yeah, we did look at identity protection, of course, very inspired by Welcome to Chechnya, but we did look also at how we can use generative AI to visualize testimony. We have a lot of audio testimony, or so how can we engage for advocacy uses, not for court, not for like a factual representation, but more a poetic advocacy. So we explored that question. Also the same for reconstruction of places. There are a lot of like evidence of how migration centers might look inside, what the situation, how the inhuman situation of living in or in such places. So how we can maybe reconstruct based on like evidence of people saying, yes, it was this size and the bed was here and we were not allowed to go to this place, right? So how we can reconstruct areas using generative AI. So we explored that as well. And we are about to start a second series of exploring more case studies. But I did want to mention also, Kat, the great work you have done with Sam at Witness around satire and how the importance of using AI for framing narrative and punching up and representing all those like power dynamic absurd that exists in the world through satire. So that's another positive example for using AI.
Kelly McBride asks, have you explored what the path would look like to the creation of a transparent AI watermark and how that might be standardized? Now, Shireen and I have looked a lot into this too, but I'm curious what you all have to say.
Well, would you guys start by talking about the C2PA work and the Content Authenticity Initiative? To put you guys on the spot, sorry. Oh, sorry, Shireen and Kat.
I'm trying to look for the question, but the C2PA is a group of the Coalition for Standard Development of Authenticity and Provenance are really working on how we can embed metadata of the life cycle of content from the moment you capture it to the moment you release it. So It's creating signature along the way of a life cycle of that content, from the camera signature, if the companies are part of that coalition, to how you edit, what type of filter you use while editing, and so on, to releasing that on, like, let's say Facebook, and that's also being edited. So there is like a really record that hopefully will be accessible to the public to really be informed of and really understand what they're seeing. So that's what is being developed as standards and being really adopted by more and more companies. Google joined lately, along with LinkedIn, which is also an interesting company to think of in that space, and other types of company that are being evolving from the start, like Microsoft and Adobe. Witness is part of that, as like really assessing what does it mean to develop standard from a human rights perspective, and what's the consideration we have to keep in mind when we're attaching signature to a content, such as privacy, accessibility, and so on. So that's part of our work in that.
That's great. One of the things we haven't done a lot of exploration on this. This is something we're just starting to work on, especially with our toolkit, to kind of think about. I don't know how much interest there is in having a standardized one. Like, in some ways, I think filmmakers are probably more interested in something that's going to be more creative, and that they can integrate more and not take the filmmaker out. But another thing that we've talked to people about is the possibility of archives actually creating the flip, like some kind of imprint to show something being authentic media. And so for them to go into their collections and find a way to label what is not generated media, what is not synthetic. And then also, that obviously has the advantage of the intentionality not being as compromised. Like, it requires people to make the decision to label what they're doing as generative AI. And as we said, like, I'm sure within the documentary field, there would be sort of an honesty level of that, but more broadly, I don't know if on TikTok people are really going to do that. So I think it's a complicated and interesting question. We're talking with Starling Lab. They're sort of trying to put some case studies into practice around that. And I think there are a lot of people kind of working on it, and certainly C2PA is doing some really exciting work on it.
I'll just add two quick things on the subject of watermarks. Shireen and I wrote an article in Wired about creative ways in which artists and documentarians have disclosed that they're using technologies, and particularly Kendrick Lamar is a really inspirational use of the technology. But I think also we need to think about that it's not as simple as what is human generated and what is AI generated, that increasingly we're talking about a spectrum. So how do we even watermark that? And finally, I think something that Shireen and I have given a lot of thought to is the historical question around watermark. Watermarks are nothing new. They've been around as long as the printing press and paper have been around, and they've been an attempt to, the cat and mouse game of authenticating material and paper and brand and copyright. And over the centuries, we've witnessed this cat and mouse game. So watermarks are an attempt. They're not the only way to address this, whether they're visible or invisible. And it's actually a fascinating cultural history of this attempt to authenticate the truth. We're gonna
can I just add another question that we are grappling quite a bit, is also what the actually impact of watermarks, right? Like, people know something is a watermark, people might know see a generative AI label, but does it really impact how they remember that content, how they feel to that content, and what they actually want to know? Sometimes we just want to know what we want to know, right? Is it really changing people's minds when we know something is fake or not? So that's also a big question we are asking ourselves as we're working on watermarks and that and the different use cases of that.
Ayawakulenko is asking, thanks so much for these guidelines. They're necessary and useful. Are there any anecdotal reports where generating AI from real footage of real people in order to hide identity for political reasons, can it be reverse engineered to reveal the person? So this could be a question to APA, but also, of course, it's a huge concern for human rights activists as they collect visual evidence.
Yeah, my guess is you guys know more on that than.
Yeah, I think so too.
I guess I will add that we did experiment with that. What we found from our small experimentation, it's not like a field and it's not a big sample of cases. It's that you can reverse find the target that protected. So the person that consented to be used their face as a protector face can be reversed. So what happened with the fake, there is some kind of like the two faces are combined to one, right? So it's not so obvious who is that subject, but when you are use different face recognition tools, you can find the protectors, which might be okay in certain situations because they might come from a different geolocation. They're safe. They agree to that. There is consent. We could not find a case that from our small sample that the one that we tried to protect was in danger.
That's good.
Melanie LaRosa asks, have you considered some way of certifying that archival material is not changed by AI, like a seal of authenticity? What do you say to that?
Oh yeah, go for it, Jen, please.
I mean, that's the flip side is, are we, IDing what's AI generated, or are we IDing what's authentic? And we've had conversations around the possibilities of both. Rachel mentioned the Starling Lab, and they're doing a lot of work around trying to embed, they come out of the Shoah Foundation. So, there's a concern for authenticating media and a visual historical record. And so they're talking about and exploring different ways to embed authentic historical artifacts with some kind of tag that indicates, the provenance of these images. So that is the flip side. And we're in conversation with different groups about different possibilities, but that is one of them.
And of course, cameras are going into this too. Sorry to interrupt,
Yes.
but cameras are moving in this direction.
I'm curious to speak with folks in the archive space of whether or not like scanners of 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter film or 35 millimeter negatives, if they will embed something like a C2PA standard of authenticity. And I want to say something in general about documentary is there's no like ethics board of documentary, and that's why partially we're so inspired by the work of the Documentary Accountability Working Group, is because some really amazing individuals and artists came together to look at what can we do to have an agreement, especially around our relationships with the subjects of our films or the participants in our films. So the place where some sort of standardization would come into our work as archival producers would definitely be on the research side, so that if we went to Bridgman Images, for example, if Bridgman said this is a real photograph, this has not been altered by generative AI, that means we could bring that into our project and tell our team this is the real thing. But then again, sometimes you actually do want to bring in generated images because you're making a film about misinformation, for example. So it's not necessarily that authenticity is also the best possible thing, but knowing the truth of a document and knowing that whether or not it has been altered for sure is very important, and there isn't yet a standard within the archive space.
Shanti Avirgan asks, I'm curious what the implications are for appearance rights when a filmmaker feeds a real photograph of a person into a generative AI program. For example, in order to create images of that person in different historical contexts where there are no existing archival images. Does the raw image of that person's likeness then become property of the AI company to be potentially deployed elsewhere? Good question.
There are a lot of, I'm going to look at, hi Shanti. There are a lot of different questions within this question. So let's see. So first of all, that is something that we've been told is happening, especially in true crime, by APA members, of basically there's one photo of someone and from like a yearbook, for example, and then they'll use a generative model to age that person or de-age that person. And what I would say there is you need to be transparent, especially if you're doing some sort of, well, not especially, but if you're doing something with true crime, you need to be transparent. You should get, you should consider getting consent from the person that you're doing that to, because what you're doing is creating new historical images. So that's layer one of your, if you're using a generative program.
And just to add on to that, just to layer one, is you also have to remember that there are assumptions being made by the machine, and then what's being created isn't necessarily what they looked like when they were younger. And the places that they're putting them are going to always have assumptions. I mean, one thing we had thought a lot about is when things are added to a particular space, how does that change the implications of what that person would have experienced in that place? And even if it's empty space and you're just creating more desolation, so I think that's a big part of the implication, is remembering that there are assumptions being added in, even if your starting point is real. Again, yeah, Steph, back to you on layer two.
On layer two, so okay, of a person, for example, if you use a create, okay. Does that raw material of that person's likeness then become property of the AI company to potentially be deployed elsewhere? The word property, so first of all, it really depends on what software you're using. So for example, if you as a creator upload your material on Adobe Stock to be used, there's no way to opt out of your material being scraped for their generative model. And every single tech company has different terms and conditions around what they can do with your material. Also, even if there are terms and conditions, it's really possible it's been scraped anyway because it's on the internet and large language models and tech companies consider what they're doing as fair use. So just as one example, it was reported in the New York Times that OpenAI downloaded 1 million hours of YouTube videos, transcribed them, and then used those transcripts to train their AI models. So if what you're doing is creating a small language model and it's a local server, it's possible that the answer is no, it couldn't be trained. But I think, if I post a selfie on Instagram, like I know that's going to be used to train stuff. So there's a lot to learn and a lot I still need to do around educating myself as just a user of someone who uses the internet around what material is being scraped. And it's really still an open legal and business question of whether or not any of that will ever need to be credited, if it even can be credited, and if we can even track where any of our digital assets are going. And what I want to add here is we've been approached by archives who are being approached by AI companies to digitize and then license them their archival content. So for example, they'll digitize some stuff, and for $2 million for a term of 2 years, OpenAI can train their large language model on the material owned by an archive. And archives don't really know what to do right now. As to our understanding, there is actually no kind of best practices guide for archives around whether or not and how to engage with AI companies. So there's definitely a Wild West thing happening there around, the sort of Faustian bargain therein.
Yeah, and we are hoping to get involved in that conversation in the near future with archives, because most archives, if you don't know, you probably know, they're all struggling. Most of them are struggling for money, for funding, and this is very tempting. And most of the materials that most archives have are not online and are, it's very hard to access them. So there is this kind of temptation of, oh, I can get our whole collection online, accessible, all that. But that, it could be a Faustian bargain. It's definitely worth exploring the flip side.
A crisis in archives meets the dominance of these AI tech companies.
Exactly.
Perfect storm.
Who make their money off of our data. And so this is a continuation of how they've been using their models for a very long time.
So hope and despair being held at the same time. I am so sorry that this is the end of our time together.
Oh my God, that went so fast.
I know these, you've been amazing and the questions have been formidable. Stephanie, Rachel, and Jen, thank you so much. Shireen, thank you so much for co-moderating and being with us today. I also want to thank ODL co-creation producer Akmira Tuliev and the Open Doc Lab Fellows for being with us. Please join us November 12th for the next talk with Hannah Jayanti about her photogrammetry project of U.S. public landscapes. This lecture series and everything we do at the lab and the studio is made possible through the incredible support of MacArthur Foundation and Just Films at Ford Foundation. So thank you all, as always, for joining. See you next time.